based on what I've done to this point, it's probably the biggest win of my career. You know, in Dalton, he was also facing jail time. The judge hadn't actually put him in jail like he had in Dupree, but Dalton was also facing jail time, not just wage garnishment, but it was kind of a both. He just hadn't actually gone to jail, so that wasn't really the squared up issue on the table. And I'll never forget, before we went up on appeal in Dalton, I had to actually go argue in front of the trial court, and it was in a rural court in Texas. And I knew the judge was going to be very opposed to my arguments. So I actually had a lawyer on standby because I felt like there was a possibility that the judge would be so offended by my arguments going against what he wanted to do in the case, which was garnish the wages and put my client in jail. And he was so determined to put my client in jail for violating the court order that me showing up in his courtroom to attempt to explain why he couldn't do what he was trying to do would be offensive to him. So I was so concerned about doing this in his courtroom and being in this little small rural town in Texas, in rural Texas, that I actually had a lawyer on standby ready to come get me out of jail in case the judge put me in jail for making the argument.
Really? Like that there was like a chance that happened?
There was a chance.
And can you explain to me rural judges, like the experience of being in rural courtrooms in Texas, like what that's like versus like maybe just like a major city?
I don't know that it's even really that different, rural versus city. I think that judges, kind of, their job is to rule their courtroom. Like it's their little kingdom and they're the king. And they're supposed to follow the rules and the laws and all of that. And the appellate system is designed that if you think the judge of that courtroom didn't follow the law, then you appeal it, and there's a system for, deciding if the judge followed the law. But a lot of times judges get offended by the concept of appealing their ruling, and they take it a little bit personally. And so I don't know that that's a rural versus city problem. I think the problem for me was that I was just far away from home. And if I'd gotten put in jail, like I didn't have any friends out there that would come and get me out very quickly. So I had a friend on standby that, if I texted the code word, like he knew, like he needed to come running and come get me out of jail.
That's funny. So same deal, airtight in Oklahoma, half toothless in Texas. Geography was the strategy. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, so the issue in Dalton was that everybody relocated to Texas. And so the question was, what states' enforceability laws applied? The other state, Oklahoma, had certain laws about how a divorce decree got enforced, and then Texas had certain laws about how a divorce decree got enforced. And so the question was, if we all live in Texas and we're filing an enforcement in Texas, then does Oklahoma law apply about how we're going to enforce this decree, or does Texas law apply? And so basically the moral of the story was that if you're going to sue in Texas, then Texas law applies, which kind of reminds me, I think in story lyrics, right? So it reminds me, like, if you're going to play in Texas, you got to have a fiddle in the band, right? Yeah. So if you're going to play in Texas, like, you got to play by Texas rules. The wife was wanting to apply the Oklahoma law because it was more stringent in how this divorce decree was going to get enforced. But the law basically was that Texas rules for how we're going to enforce alimony, we're going to apply if you're going to sue in Texas to enforce it, which meant that the Texas lens looked at the decree and said, is this contractual, or does it comply with how we would put somebody in jail for a non-payment of a post-divorce support order?
This is so fascinating. Okay, so the court tried to carve new slices of his retirement to cover the alimony. Why could it not?
So at that time, the law said that you could not take retirement account. Again, that's like debt collector law that says that your retirement is preserved for you and cannot be taken for your debt collectors. Since then, the law has actually in Texas, it's changed on that. They passed a new statute because they didn't like, the legislature didn't like the Supreme Court's ruling in this case. And so the legislature can always come back and say, we don't like that Supreme Court ruling, and through their legislative branch, they can overrule the judicial branch and pass a new law. So they've actually done that in this situation and said that in certain very limited circumstances, such as alimony, kind of like you can't discharge it in bankruptcy, then it can come out of retirement.
Interesting. That's good to know. Okay, so the Supreme Court cited your own earlier cases to get there. 15 years, 3 cases. Kind of wrap it all for me. What was the moral? What was the lessons? Kind of what was that experience like?
I mean, the experience for me having these 3 trilogy of cases on alimony enforcement that are all now considered Texas Supreme Court authority. To me, there's only maybe one honor that would be higher than that, and that would be to have a U.S. Supreme Court case. Like for me, being a Texas lawyer, having 3 cases that are, I have more than that, but having these 3 cases that are all kind of in this same genre of Texas law, being the authority on that point, and Texas Supreme Court authority, like there's not that many things that could be more honorable to me to create a body of law like that. It for me is somewhat of kind of a defining point of my career as an appellate family lawyer.
No, I mean, I think this is awesome. This to me definitely lays a big foundation of where your authority comes from. I mean, this isn't something that every lawyer can say they've accomplished. So it is pretty awesome. So let's get a little bit to the friction of this, right? Michelle, square it for me. So you fight for women. You are the pro-woman lawyer. The man ain't the plan lawyer. You built the line of the law that protects the person who does not want to pay alimony. So hold both of that at once for me.
The way that I look at it is that when I am in my lawyer role, I am an advocate for the client that's paying me. And I have to build a wall. Like lawyers have to build a wall between their job for the client as an advocate versus their own personal belief system or their own personal viewpoints, right? So when I have that great wall of Michelle built up, there's Michelle the lawyer who is advocating for the client that paid me. Yes. In these 3 cases, the client that paid me was not the wife. The wife could have paid me. The wife could have come and hired me first and asked me to be her advocate in any of these cases, enforcing the obligation to pay. But she didn't. In those 3 cases, it happened to be that the husband or the ex-husband was the one that hired me. But when I'm over here in my personal advocacy, as a personal advocate, for what I personally believe, then I can have those belief systems. But there's any lawyer will tell you that there's this wall that gets erected that our personal belief system is beside the point when we're acting on behalf of our client. It would be like saying to a criminal defense lawyer, like, how can you represent somebody accused of a heinous crime if you don't believe in heinous crimes, right? Like, you don't have to believe that your client acted properly to give them a defense under the law. Because if that's the way that our judicial system worked, then only those whose beliefs were in the popularity of society would have representation. And that's actually the diametric opposite of how our society of justice works. Our justice system is designed that those who are least among us, those who are accused of the most, have the best representation. And if we don't, as a justice system, make sure that that is protected and that our people who are accused of things have an advocate who fully advocates their position, not our position, then our justice system falls apart.
Yeah, I think that's super powerful. Why do you think people struggle with that concept?
I think that lay people who are not trained as lawyers, I think it's really hard to understand this concept of the Great Wall of your personal belief system. And I think as a society these days, like, we are so free to spout our personal beliefs all over everybody, like on the internet, on a street corner, protesting everywhere, to your family, to your friends, over the Thanksgiving dinner table. Like, we just spout our personal beliefs, and our society, I think because of reality TV, frankly, but I think our society has kind of gotten to this place where we think we're entitled to expound on our own personal beliefs and just kind of vomit those on everybody. But as lawyers, we are taught in law school kind of to have this distinction between our lawyer advocacy and our personal belief system, such that we are not entitled to cross the two boundaries. We're not entitled to take our personal belief system and cross it over here into lawyer land. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some things that I have a personal belief that crosses over. There are certain types of cases that just I will not handle because I cannot keep the boundary up. So if there's something like that where I cannot keep that boundary of my personal belief system up, then I will decline the case because I can't be the best advocate for that client. But there's other lawyers who can better advocate for that client.
That's very wise and like maybe lessons for aspiring lawyers that are watching. How do you build that wall? How long does that take to create that? What is that process like? Looking back in your career, just kind of break that down.
For me, it was at about the 5-year mark of my career that I really kind of realized that I needed to, make that wall a little bit stronger. I think that it's very easy, especially as a young lawyer or a young litigator, I think it's very easy to confuse like your personal emotion and your advocacy and get those two things kind of enmeshed. Like you have emotion for your client, you want to show empathy for your client, they're in a really bad spot or whatever. And then you get your personal beliefs and like it all gets kind of confused. But you can only be the best advocate for the client when you are having a neutral mindset, because you have to see the whole board and know what's coming at you. You've got to think of things from the other side's perspective and know what they're going to do and be able to see it very neutrally or even oppositionally in order to do a good job advocating for your client. So at about the 5th year of my career, I kind of had this epiphany that, as a family lawyer, clients don't call me from the bar at midnight or I guess it's 2 a.m. now, but they don't call me from the bar and say like, hey, Michelle, I'm drunk and I'm going to go home with this person and I'm not going to use protection and I'm going to have sex and then we're going to get pregnant and then I'm going to have a baby with them and I know nothing about them. I don't know if they're a good person, a bad person, a crazy person. I don't know if they have a good family. I don't know if they have an STD. Like I don't know nothing about this person, But they don't give me the opportunity to be on the upstream end of that decision making to say like, whoa, bad idea, stop, or use a condom or, whatever. Like they don't give me any upstream decision making in that process. Clients only come to me after the decisions are already made and they're already suffering the consequences of the decisions. So, they only call me after the baby's born and after they already have the other partner in the situation and, they already are in this place where they wish they'd made a different choice. So I don't get the choice to be upstream of the decision. I only get the choice to be downstream of the crisis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so Texas is one of the most alimony hostile states in America. Is that right or wrong? Take a side. Let me know how you feel about that.
Yeah, no, Texas is, factually, one of the most hostile states to alimony in the country. Like almost every other state in the country has better alimony statutes than Texas does. And that comes because we are based more on Spanish law, where the rest of the country is based more on British law. We're based more on Spanish law because we were part of Mexico at one point. The fact that Texas is hostile to alimony, we were the last state in the country to even adopt an alimony statute. Before, there was this movement where the federal government was kind of pushing down federal funding or threatening to withhold federal funding if the state did not have an alimony statute. And so Texas actually held out back in the early 2000s, held out before it actually would pass an alimony statute. And the only reason they did it was because of this threat of withholding federal funding. So we were kind of almost forced to pass this alimony statute. So when the legislature finally passed one, they just made it like so restrictive that it really only applies to this kind of subset of people that really, 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 really need it.
So then to follow up on that, who does Texas alimony law actually hurt, and then who does it protect?
So Texas alimony law actually protects, kind of this stereotypical maybe wife who has been a stay-at-home mother who has not had job skills in the job market and cannot just go out and get a job that'll meet her needs. It's obviously gender neutral, but that's just the typical fact pattern that we see. It might apply to a husband too. It's just we don't see that as often. Or a spouse who has had some sort of physical disability, or a child of the parties who has a physical disability, such that there is an amount of care or an amount of disability that prevents the spouse from working. So if the spouse has a disability and they can't go get a job and they can't meet their minimum needs because of it, then whether you want a divorce or not, you're going to pay alimony to that spouse to make sure that they can, live. If there's a child of the marriage that has a physical disability such that the child requires maybe 24/7 care, maybe there's not enough assets to go around to afford, a caretaker for the child so that the other spouse can work, or maybe that doesn't financially make sense, then that spouse is going to be the caretaker. Then the spouse, even if they want a divorce, they're still going to have to support that floor to help make sure those minimum needs are taken care of.
Makes a lot of sense. Where did the no-fault divorce actually come from?
Yeah, so no-fault divorce actually originated in California. President Reagan wanted a divorce, and he was going to have to go through this process of getting a divorce by showing fault, which was required in the state of California in order to get a divorce. But he was the one cheating, and he didn't really want to go through that being a politician. This was obviously before he was president, but he didn't want to go through all of that and the controversy that was going to cause. So he influenced, the legislators and everybody to kind of pass this no-fault divorce statute so that a person could get a divorce without going through all the controversy, legal fees, and public-facing, airing of what happened in the private marriage that a fault-based divorce requires. So once no-fault divorce caught on in California, it spread like wildfire across the rest of the country. And no-fault divorce, even though it kind of started because of Reagan, it actually is very protective of women. And a lot of women don't see it that way, but I would encourage them to maybe think about it a little bit differently, because if all we had was the 1950s based version of our statutes that required you to prove fault in order to get a divorce, that means that you have to have a public airing of your private marital situation. Think about like Judge Judy and what Judge Judy or divorce court or any of those TV divorce, TV type family law situations looks like, and then apply that to your own personal stuff. How would you like it if all of your stuff was right there on TV with the who did what to who's being laid out, and all your family and friends being called in as witnesses? And did he have sex with this person? And did you talk about him bad to this person? And did he abandon you? And were you crazy? And like your mental state is on trial and his infidelity's on trial, and like all your private stuff is laid out there for all the public to see and make judgments on. And these days it all be on YouTube. So that's not good for anybody, and it's expensive because you got to have lawyers to do it, and then you're dragging your friends and family into your private business. So no-fault divorce actually solves that problem and just says, like, y'all can get divorced just because you don't get along and because one person wants it. And if somebody wants out of the marriage, they're going to get out of the marriage.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. So last question here. So why did no-fault divorce maybe help women more than alimony ever did?
Because no-fault divorce helped women more than alimony ever did, because no-fault divorce lets women get out of trapped bad marriages. If a woman is trapped in a bad marriage, maybe because of abuse, or maybe a husband who's not doing anything and she's carrying the whole load, like whatever the bad marriage is, if a woman wants out of a bad marriage, a woman can get out of a bad marriage because of no-fault divorce, where in the 50s and 60s, before no-fault divorce came along, a woman was trapped in a marriage with a bad spouse.